I'm really sorry that I missed the opening session. We had a number of issues going on this morning, and it sounds like it was really fascinating, but one thing we haven't really delved into yet, and something that obviously is near and dear to my heart, and that is impacts to California agriculture specifically, but agriculture on a global basis, as well as the emissions from California agriculture, both crop and livestock, what the challenges are for getting some of that under control as well. So I'm really looking forward to a great discussion with these three esteemed panelists here today. We have Dr. Max Auffhammer, Dr. David Zilberman, UC Berkeley is sitting in the middle together, and then we have Dr. Dan Sumner, who is the director of the Ag Issues Center, which is UC, but he's also an economist and holds the Frank Buck Endowed Chair for Ag Economics at UC Davis. So we have a wealth of knowledge here. I have some questions I'm going to be asking them, and we'll have some time to let each one of them respond to that. But what I'm really looking forward to, and I think the most important value of having this type of an intimate setting, is that we have a lot of interaction with the audience to see what's on your mind as far as questions, as well as comments you want to make, and really thinking through, with this fabulous agricultural sector that we have in California, how do we ensure that California agriculture continues to thrive? When I think about climate change and what a few degrees and chill hour means for the kinds of markets we're in, early markets, delayed markets, where the competition is going to come into those markets, that's a small issue, but it's something that's very profound for the people who are trying to plan ahead, which when you're growing permanent crops, you definitely have to do. One that the Department of Food and Agriculture is deeply involved in is what happens with invasive pests. The proliferation of pests that we have, the introduction of pests we've never had, their ability to move into parts of the state where we've never had them before, especially when I think about our rich forest sector and what that actually means. The spread of disease. We don't think about climate change and the spread of disease. Having just dealt with an avian influenza situation just south of here 3.5 weeks ago, and understanding how rapidly pathogens can mutate from livestock to animals, it certainly has to be an element we're giving it thought to. Increased atmospheric carbon, higher mean temperatures. Having come out of the wine grape sector for such a long time, I know that what they really look at is this, not so much changing in temperatures, but specifically those nighttime temperatures. What does that mean for the quality of what we produce? Are we still going to have 400 crops? Are we going to be changing the kind of cropping patterns that we do have? Where are the strategic advantages that we really want to make sure we're rallying around and protecting? I'm looking forward to the answers from everyone here, but let me just throw out a couple of very specific questions for you to think about. Are there opportunities? Because for everything that has a challenge, there's also an opportunity. Opportunities for gains from longer summers and those changes in patterns. What does that mean? What could it mean possibly for double cropping? We certainly know there has to be a lot more work done in plant breeding to make sure we've got the varietals that can withstand these changes. How will climate change impact the economic trajectory of California agriculture? What are the future opportunities for greenhouse gas abatement in agriculture? This is, I think, a very exciting opportunity for us to be engaged in. The role of biofuels, methane capture. Does methane capture become more important in a world concerned about tipping points? So, Max, I'm going to turn for you first. I'm really excited that you're here today because I still remember the governor's conference on climate change. He did that about 11 months after he took office, and you were one of the keynote speakers. First of all, you're a great speaker. You had a lot of great content. You've really done a lot of thinking about California agriculture and what the risks are for our future. At that conference, we heard about the impacts of climate change and the importance of doing something about it. You've been a very important part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. At that conference, we also had Sir Richard Branson. Sorry, I have to take a moment, Colin. The bluest blue eyes I have ever seen. It was hard for me to take my eyes off of this beautiful figure of a man and introduce him with the kind of, decorum that was required. And I just blew it again, didn't I? Probably won't get invited to do one of these panels ever again. But it was a fascinating day. Now here we are 2.5 years later. Certainly as an administration, we're spending many, many hours on climate change. The Department of Food and Agriculture convened a climate change consortium really focused on adaptation strategies that we needed for specialty crops. We've got our adaptation strategy out there, Safeguarding California report. It's really interesting. Today we're releasing a report, preliminary stages of what the impact is of the current drought. Certainly water availability has to be addressed. So with that, I'm going to ask you a couple questions. Can you highlight the main points that you articulated then, because they were so good and I'm sure they're embedded in your memory. And I think they're still pertinent today. And also if you can touch on what has changed. The other element of that is talk a little bit about, I understand you have a forthcoming paper and maybe you want to clue us in on that. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Auffhammer.
All right, thank you very much for having me at this event. I have to say, sitting on this couch, I feel a little bit like I'm on Jimmy Fallon.
Well, let's try to introduce some good humor, okay?
All right, maybe we'll have a singing contest later.
You sing, I'll listen.
Excellent. So also, I am not going to be as clear and well organized as Ben Santer. By Arrhenius, that man is clear. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is the sort of general challenges for California as a whole under climate change, and then zoom in a little bit on agricultural specifically. The Berkeley press office calls me Dr. Doom 1.0, and I will turn to my colleagues for solutions here. So bad news, good news. When you're thinking about impacts of climate change on economic sectors, the thing you need to really separate here is you need two things. The first thing you need is a sensitivity of that sector to climate change. That means as the long-term distribution of weather changes, is the sector actually sensitive to climate? There are some sectors that aren't, and there are some sectors that are. So agriculture, of course, is one sector. As anybody who's ever been on a farm, that's maybe the most weather sensitive of all the economic sectors. The other thing you need for impacts is a change in climate, right? Even if you have a sensitive sector, if climate isn't changing, there's no problem here. So what we learned from Ben this morning is that we project that by end of century, there will be most likely significant changes in climate. Now, to a farmer, I was born on a farm. We moved into the suburbs when I was a year old, but I'll still claim that I was born on a farm, which gets me some sympathy. What you worry about here is the single notion, not climate as this whole thing, but there's specific aspects of climate that are really important to different types of crops and livestock production and dairies, for example, that vary from subsector to subsector and crop to crop. So what the impacts are on these different sectors really depends on where in agriculture you reside and what you're trying to grow. So let's pick these apart a little bit for a minute and think about what this means for California. So the way I like to think about it is there's three aspects of climate that really matter. The first one, and I have a cheat sheet down here, unfortunately on the side where I have my bad eye. So fire, heat, and drought, to me, are the three aspects of climate that we should really worry about here. So we all know that we're currently in an incredible drought. Everybody's very much worried about wildfires, but what does that mean for California's economy as a whole? 40% of California's population live in areas that are of high fire risk, so there's a huge amount of assets that's actually in areas that are already in high fire risk. And if you link projections of climate change to risk maps of wildfires, that is going to grow that proportion. So the amount of money that's tied up and located in an area, it's not movable, right, that is going to be exposed to wildfires in the future is significant and is growing. The second thing you want to worry about here, and that's something that matters to agriculture as well, is air pollution. There is no more efficient producer of particulate matter air pollution than a wildfire. If you look at what's going on in San Diego very dramatically right now, the amount of particulate matter that comes out of small and big wildfires is just amazing. It's deposited on leaves, it creates health issues, has huge economic impacts in very short periods of time. So more wildfires mean more extreme air pollution events going forward. The last thing we worry about from wildfire, or one of the major things we should worry about from wildfires for California's economy, which is important to the agricultural sector, is transmission capacity. So we use a lot of energy, we use a lot of electricity, but we get a lot of our electricity from out of state. A lot of our renewables actually come from the north, and there's transmission lines that bring electricity into the state here. And under climate change and increased wildfire risk, these transmission lines will be affected negatively by wildfires. You don't have to take down a transmission line for it to be a problem, but if you have deposits of soot on transmission lines, if they get hot, if trees fall on them, there's all kinds of risks for our ability to actually provide electricity when we need it most. Now let's talk about heat. Heat is something that most farmers, unless you're growing cotton, really don't enjoy very much. So the notion here is, I'm going to clarify that statement because that already sounds like it's something that I said that's wrong here. It's not. So there's been evidence over and over and over again, and one of the experts who's going to be on a panel this afternoon has worked on this, who's here today, is we've shown that for a lot of the main crops, if you're thinking of soy, if you're thinking of wheat, and a lot of the other crops, what really matters for yields is exposure to heats above roughly 30 degrees centigrade. So you have a day above 30 degrees centigrade that really negatively affects yields for the major food crops in the United States. There's been a lively debate about this, but it doesn't matter what weather data set you use, what crop data set you use. This has been confirmed over and over again. Now, if you're thinking about climate change, what climate change is going to do, it's going to shift the weather distribution, my right, your left, so this way, right, up to the higher end of the temperature distribution. That means even if the variance of weather stays the same, just shifting the mean up, you will get more extreme heat events. And this increased frequency of extreme heat events is going to do damage to crops that are sensitive to extreme temperatures. This will happen not just in California, this will happen in the areas that grow most of these crops. So think of Iowa and the Midwest in general. So that's one thing. If we're thinking about the things we grow in California, we grow so many things in California. I'm not going to start listing them because we would be here till this evening. But there's a lot of high-value crops that have very specific requirements in terms of nighttime temperatures, what the dew points are, all kinds of interesting parts of weather measures I won't bore you with. But the issue is that we don't really understand very well for many of these specialty crops how climate or weather is actually going to affect yields here. So there was a very nice set of meetings where growers came together with nerdy academics like me and policymakers organized by Secretary Ross, where we spoke about specialty crops and what climate change is going to mean for these crops. If you look at the value of the assets in the ground, if we're talking about things that are going to remain in the ground for a long time, these are massive investments by the agricultural sector. So if weather changes in a way that is not favorable to these crops or these things in the ground, you're putting huge amounts of assets at risk here. What we unfortunately don't know is which crop is going to be affected how. So for some crops we actually have some understanding, but for the majority of them we don't know. The other thing you want to worry about here is microclimates, for example. What happens in Napa Valley if that nice fog that grows in goes away, moves 20 miles, 30 miles to the north, and you have a degree change in temperature on average at nighttime? These grapes, right, we all enjoy them very much, are incredibly sensitive to these small dimensions of weather that if they change in the long run, it may put a whole wine industry at risk short of adaptation. And the next panel is going to talk about adaptation opportunities. Now, we could talk about this forever, but I'll leave this for questions. The last thing we're going to talk about briefly is floods. So I know there's all these maps around, and I just did my very first art project at the Queens Museum in New York. It was very, very good. I'm happy to talk about this, but we're not here to talk about art. But talking about what happens as sea level rises. So Ben Santer spoke a little bit about the news we got this week about the West Antarctic ice sheet. But even if we think about a 3-foot rise in sea level globally, which is sort of the mean of projections. Could be much bigger, could be a little bit smaller. What you really want to worry about is not this notion that, oh, seas are going to be a meter higher and, that the beaches will be flooded a little bit more and the people in their $6 million homes at the coasts may have some of their gardens flooded. What you want to worry about here is what happens if you get a storm on top of a meter sea level rise. This is the notion of extreme events. And this is something that every planner, and many of you in this room are planners, worry about, right? How do we plan for 100-year floods, for example? It's the flood that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. If all of a sudden half of Silicon Valley is underwater, or if all of a sudden lots of the coastal areas that have lots of power generation are underwater under these 100-year floods in the presence of climate change, when they weren't without climate change, this is something we should worry about. This doesn't mean we should abandon the coasts and all move to the Central Valley, even though I love the Central Valley. What this means is as we make decisions going forward, we have to take into account this new variable that really matters when we plan, meaning what does the world look like, not just in the face of the rapidly growing population, rapidly growing incomes, but also this world that has climate change coming with certainty. It's a little bit like planning for retirement, right? We know our health is going to be worse when we retire. At some point, it's going to get really bad with certainty. So the notion here is, are you going to ignore this, or are you going to slowly incorporate this knowledge that, as you learn new information about what your health status is going to be going forward, into the decisions you make for retirement? Climate change is a slow-moving process that lets you make decisions now that have long-run implications, which from an economic point of view raises many interesting questions about investments required now versus benefits that you're going to gather in the future. So I'm going to wrap up because I don't want to take too much time here. But the big worry about drought and water isn't sea level rise in California agriculture. It's one thing, and it's one thing alone. It's the ability to store large quantities of irrigation water. Everyone in this room here knows that we don't have a dam big enough to store all the irrigation water required to, irrigate all these beautiful almond trees is it almonds or almonds? I'm German.
It depends which place you are in the state.
Okay, I'm going to go.
They're both right.
So you pick whichever way you like, all right? But if you're thinking about all of these things we're growing that require irrigation water in the state, we rely on the Sierra snowpack. If it gets warmer, the ability of the Sierra snowpack to store this water in the form of snow and ice and then slowly dispense it like a natural dispensation system over the time period when we most need this water will diminish. We were not allowed to bring PowerPoint slides. Even Ben broke that rule. I was kind of jealous. But there are projections in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that show you what the snowpack is likely going to look like going forward towards the end of the century, and it's really, really worrisome. What you may get is you'll get less water, significantly less water stored in the snowpack, and you'll have most likely more rapid melting in the springtime, so you'll have less water that comes down more quickly at times when you actually don't necessarily need it, when you'd rather move it towards later in the season. So to me personally, the one thing we should do is we should worry about the snowpack when it comes to climate change and agriculture, and that's the thing we should plan for. So that also means I'm wasting your time. You should just go to the last panel this afternoon, which is going to talk about this issue. Now, last minute or a minute and a half here, the question you asked is what have we learned since this nice event that the governor put on, and I agree about the blue eyes. It's amazing, right? It's not a Photoshop thing. They really are that blue. Not Governor Brown, Sir Richard Branson. But the thing where we're getting lots more evidence in economics, and I think this is a really exciting literature, is the impact of hot temperatures on productivity, right? So there's this, going back in the academic literature and going back in time, there's always been this stylized fact that there's an environment-economy trade-off. Either you pick the green or you pick the, I'm not going to give the economy a color, the economy, right? So there's some trade-off there. But what we're actually seeing here is something pretty interesting, is that these things actually work in many parts hand in hand instead of as a trade-off. So if you're looking at agricultural productivity of field workers outside working on the fields, and anybody who's ever been out there will testify to this, when it's really, really hot outside, not only do your crops suffer, but the people that are working on the fields are also suffering in measurable ways. So there's a very nice new paper by Matt Nidell, and it's an exploding literature out there that actually documents that we can see measurable negative productivity impacts on farm worker productivity. There's a study that came out of MIT last year or 2 years ago that actually documents evidence across countries, not just for California or the US, but across countries, that hot temperatures lead to lower economic output in measurable terms of GDP. And one of the two sectors that was most affected by hot temperatures that explained that slower economic growth at the country level was the agricultural sector. And Marshall Burke has some work on this now too, so maybe he can talk about this a little bit later too. So I think the takeaway message here is one where, while lots of blogs and newspapers, talk about climate change in similar terms as they do about most disasters, very dramatic, but it's a slow-moving process. It doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about it now. We'll see an increased frequency of certain events, even in the nearish future, the next 10 to 20 years. But it is a slow-moving process. And the nice thing about slow-moving processes is you have not a lot of time, but you can really carefully think about, rather rapidly, about what the optimal strategy is here and how we should respond in terms of mitigation, meaning reducing emissions, and adaptation in terms of what types of investments should we be making in order to prepare us for the future that's coming down with some uncertainty, but that's certainly coming our way. So I thank you. I went 29 seconds over, and I will turn it back to you.
Well, congratulations. So you're going to have to beat that, Dan. I would love to do Q&A right now, but I want to give everyone a chance for their 15 minutes. So please be jotting down your questions, your thoughts, because there's going to be a lot of really great information here. So, Dr. Sumner, you've been the director of the Agricultural Issues Center for a few years now, and I personally want to say how valuable your leadership has been. You provide a lot of tools for all of us as you track the impacts of farm policy and export policy and our export data and a variety of workforce issues. And let me throw in dairy policy and pricing. So I really have enjoyed my recent 6 months working with you. But I'm hoping that you can speak to, and I think it's a good segue, just really focusing in on the economics as well as mitigation policies of climate change and what that means for California agriculture.
Thank you. For the record, I think Max is an awfully nice-looking guy, too. So
of course, I meant everyone here is nice-looking. I just don't see the same blue intensity.
No.
So I'm going to focus specifically on California. But in doing that, I think it's very important we talk about global climate change. We also have to talk about global markets. So to understand what climate change means to California agriculture, it may be even more important to look at how the climate is changing outside of California. When I talk to almond growers, for example, I say, well, we're not really sure what the climate's going to do to you in California. We grow almonds from Kern County up to north of Colusa County, quite a range of climates. Mean temperature is really quite different between Colusa County and Kern County in the south. But what you guys really need to worry about is if the climate changes somewhere in China such that almonds becomes an ideal crop for them, that's the big regime change, I think. And so we can get too wrapped up in looking at what the climate is doing here. Now, for an individual grower, of course, that matters to the individual grower because it's going to change how he or she adapts to the climate on that farm. But it's important to think about this in a market context, and that means a global context. The same's true, of course, with policies. And we heard this morning, and we're reminded again that what we do with respect to climate mitigation policy here in California may have some impact. Probably its sort of physical impact on the climate is almost negligible. Its effect on the politics of climate change may be the place where it could have some significant impact, because policy is also global, and agricultural policy is global. We can do things in a policy perspective in agriculture here in California that can help or hinder agricultural production here, mostly in relation to what it does to our markets nationally and globally. And I'll give you one crystal clear example. A few years ago when we passed a proposition that would going to raise the cost of production of eggs produced in California, that would have had the impact of essentially eliminating the commercial egg industry in California. Probably wouldn't have had any effect on how eggs were produced in general, just where they were produced. They wouldn't be produced here. They'd be produced someplace that didn't have to comply with those regulations. We then came back, our state legislature came back and passed a law that said, we didn't really mean that. Now what we're going to do is have the eggs consumed in California have to meet those higher cost of production standards. And that emphasizes another point, and one that's very important for climate change. It's really a matter, we talk about how you produce something and that affects greenhouse gas emissions. But it's really consumption that drives that. It's really consumption. So that if we have some standards, for example, on how dairy products are produced in California to meet California greenhouse gas standards, or how they're processed in California to meet California greenhouse gas standards, that will have the same impact that an egg regulation has. That is, cows can move, they'll be somewhere else. Not that the industry here will move, but they'll have a harder time competing with somewhere else. What really affects how things get produced is standards about consumption. So if we had a rule that said we don't consume products unless they're produced according to standards, say with respect to greenhouse gases, that will start having impacts. And of course, the broader the population that affects, if it's a global restriction on the consumption of the standards that go into products we consume, that'll have an effect. And that's particularly true of agriculture because food is so widely traded. Not every product, not certain kinds of fresh dairy products that are very expensive to haul, but almost everything we produce in California is shipped somewhere else in the country or in the world, and much of what we consume here is produced somewhere else. Let me stay with dairy as an example. A little over half, probably 3/4 or so, of the feed consumed by California dairy cows comes from the Midwest. So when Max refers to corn and soybeans, and you say, well, gee, we don't grow those things here to any great extent, so it must be irrelevant, that's not right, because the biggest California agricultural industry is the dairy industry, and they're feeding those cows corn and soybeans coming from the Midwest, as well as silage and hay from California and lots of other things. But these market interactions globally are crucial in thinking about what climate change means to agriculture in California. Let me add one bit of data, or a couple of bits of data. One is climate has already changed. Anybody, and Max refers to people out there on the farm, anybody who's been on a farm in California, anybody paying attention, and they all are, knows that the climate's already changed. The data that we've looked at very intense data, daily data for the last 100 years or so for Yolo County. We've also done this for every wine crush district around the state of California. And there's no question climate has gotten warmer. There's been no change in daytime temperatures, daytime highs on average in California in the agricultural producing regions. There's been no change in the wintertime highs. What there's been is an increase in the lows both in the summer and the winter. The data that we've looked at over the last 100 years suggests no threat to, say, chill hours for deciduous fruits yet. And in fact, that would, at the trends we've had, that is a long way in the future. But as Max emphasized, it does change production practices to know that it's going to be warmer in the wintertime. So, for example, one of the things that we've found is that one can associate some addition of winter wheat production in Yolo County to the fact that we've had somewhat warmer winters, which improves yield. So that's a case where, in fact, wheat looks better relative to some other crop because yields have actually gone up a little bit because it's a little warmer in the wintertime. So this is not these summer extreme temperatures. In fact, in California for winter wheat, that's probably not much of an issue because we harvest starting in May, and it would take a lot to get extreme temperatures above 30 degrees that Max mentioned to affect wheat. In her introduction, Secretary Ross mentioned pest pressures, and that is also something that people are very concerned about and looking at, and it requires an adaptation. Again, let me refer to California having this really quite an array of microclimates. So one way to think about it is to say, gee, if something happens in Yolo County associated with a climate change, if it's simply warming, you say, okay, Yolo County's now a lot more like Stanislaus County has been for the last 100 years. But it's not that simple, but it's something to pay attention to. And we have some data up and down the state. And we have specialists here at the University of California that are scattered throughout the state and know local conditions and can work on that. I want to reinforce the idea about irrigation. And if you're able to stay for this afternoon's session on water, it's a crucial one, particularly for agriculture, but of course for the whole state, that we run on water. And the most graphic illustration also I associate with Jay Lund, but I'm not sure the first time I saw it. Somebody drew a picture of a pyramid and said, if you move vertically just a few feet, think about the area that you lose around that pyramid in terms of snowpack. Max knows that formula by heart. I can't remember how much area you lose around the circumference of this pyramid, but it's a lot. And so it doesn't take a lot of vertical movement, say in Mount Shasta, to lose a lot of snow. And politically, it doesn't look like there's any chance we're going to build the storage in California to offset the loss of snowpack. And so that is something that everyone should be crucially concerned about, and not just for agricultural reasons. If you think about that water running through the delta in the spring causing environmental problems there, for example. At the same time, you've got sea level rise moving salt water into the delta this way, and this is a delta that we're trying to move irrigation water through to go south. So let me just put another pitch in for the afternoon session on irrigation. I want to come back to the livestock industry for one more minute, because there's the case where mitigation potential really has to be focused. I mentioned dairy is about 20% of California agriculture by gross value produced. It's at least half the greenhouse gas emissions. That is the dairy industry alone, at least half the greenhouse gas emissions, mostly methane, and nobody has yet figured out a technology to deal with that. There are people working on it. It's mostly feeding patterns so that you reduce the amount of methane per cow. The way you reduce methane per unit of milk, which is, of course, we don't have the cows just for the sake of having cows. We're producing milk with them. The way you do that is to produce more milk per cow. You're going to get a certain amount of methane, base methane per cow. Methane goes up when you feed her more. Milk goes up when you feed her more. But you can increase the milk per unit of methane by increasing milk production per cow. Well, let me give you a couple of numbers. In California, milk production per cow is about 15 times milk production per cow in Ethiopia and Sudan, about 10 times milk production per cow in China, almost double milk production per cow in New Zealand. So if you think about, and the reason is these cows aren't walking around trying to find a meal somewhere out in the pasture. You're feeding them intensively. And that gets you lots of milk per unit of methane. But we're putting restrictions in California on methane emissions, and that could end up encouraging cows, not the cows themselves to leave, but milk production to shift commercially to places where you're going to get more methane per cow. And that's the sort of policy question we have to be very careful about. We don't want to inadvertently cause greenhouse gas emissions globally to rise because we've reduced greenhouse gas emissions from California. And that's a concern, I think, not just agriculturally, but for lots of other industries as well, we have to pay very close attention to. The final thing I'll mention about methane emissions has to do with digesters, because it's something that lots and lots of us have spent a lot of time working on, scientists, engineers, lots of other people. And California, you might think initially, would be a center place for this. It's not. California lags in digester implementation for a whole number of complicated reasons. The reasons you think it might go first was scale of the industry. Very big dairy farms, there's some scale economies to digesters. Lots of encouragement for renewable fuels, both for the energy industry and others. But the problem really is moving energy off the farm. It turns out to be incredibly complicated to move electricity off the farm. It's very expensive because the infrastructure is just not set up for electricity going in the other direction. Substations would need to be rebuilt, et cetera. And also we have air quality rules associated with the generational electricity. It turns out those seem to be difficult to meet on farms for electricity generation. So it hasn't happened. There may be, out of a couple of thousand dairy farms in the state, maybe 10 digesters, all of them built a long time ago with lots of subsidy. People are trying, working it out. It's just not happening for lots of complicated reasons. That evidently seems to be a very expensive technology for California. So that doesn't seem to be the future, and I don't really know what we're going to do about greenhouse gas emissions from the dairy industry in California, given that digesters don't yet seem like they're ready to solve the problem. Over to you.
I think that was the governor. He was really interested in that last point. Because we have been spending a ton of time on digesters. And when I left USDA, the last thing Secretary Vilsack said was, "You've got the most cows and the least number of digesters. Go fix it." And I said, "Secretary, you need to understand California and our regulatory scheme."
It's a tough one.
We've been putting a lot of time in this, and I'm still very, very optimistic about the progress we've made and what's possible. So Dr. Zilberman, I see that in addition to being a great researcher and teacher, you also are co-editor of publications for the Giannini Foundation. And I'm wondering how you are finding the inclusion of climate change topics in those publications, and if that's helping to connect us. I'm really fascinated by these discussions, how we can connect all of this great work to the policy setting arena and what kind of reception you're getting on that. But I'm especially intrigued by something that I have a passion for. You've done a lot of research looking at payment for ecosystem services and environmental markets, and I think that could be a piece of the opportunity as well as addressing the challenges we have before us. So I'm really anxious to hear from you today on some of the work that you've done.
Okay. I'd like to speak about 2 or 3 issues. The first thing is a little overview, complementing the presentation of Dan about what will be the impact of climate change, a little bit about adaptation, and then speak about payment for ecosystem services. So, as Mark said, there are 3, from agricultural perspective, there are 3 main issues that we have to deal with: temperature, variation, and water. Now, generally speaking, if you look at the big picture, climate change will raise temperature, and some crop will really suffer because there is a critical level where yield goes down. But if when temperature goes up, some crops are better off. So it really will change regional patterns. So there will be losers and winners. So if we look at, so if, for example, you're in some parts of Russia or you're some part of Michigan, you actually may win from climate change. Someone in Chicago called climate change climate improvement. So to some extent, that's one reason. It's not everyone will suffer. That's one reason that we have all this disagreement. So the aggregate effect of climate change would be negative overall in terms of agricultural production. Yield may go down between 5% to 10%, but the distributional effect will be really problematic. Canada will do very well. Mexico won't do very well. Would you take all the Mexicans and move them to Canada? That will be a big problem. And the thing about California is that we have some region in California, for example, Imperial Valley, that will really are likely to suffer. Some other region in the north will do better off. So we really speak about issues of relocations. And when we speak about issues of relocation, it's a really, really big problem, because what I worry about climate change is not what happens in the long run, besides the fact that we are all dead in the long run. What I really worry is that there will be a short period of time where the negative effect will be materializing, but the adjustment won't take place. Generally, what really happens in history is that there are periods where where adjustments don't occur and we are in trouble. So let's suppose that temperature go up, Imperial is losing production, Fresno is losing production, Kansas is losing production, but people don't invest in Canada. So we have about 3 or 4 years where prices are going up, and we return to what happened in 2008. We have regions that suffer. These regions will really result in people trying to be violent and aggressive. So to me, the main threat of climate change is all this political threat of instability. So how can you deal with it? Okay? One element is mitigation. Another element that I think is very, very important is an element of adaptation. And what does adaptation mean? Adaptation means, in my view, really taking advantage of our science and utilizing it. Now, the first thing that I really would like to do before I go further is to say that actually one of the greatest things about California is that we are very good in developing new technologies and adapting to them. Like, for example, I remember 30 years ago when several of us started speaking about 3 or 4 concepts. One is drip irrigation, the other was precision agriculture, and the third is conservation. People were very skeptical. When I started working on input use efficiency, people thought it's not economics, it's engineering. But these are topics, these are notions that we really have to think about. How to increase input use efficiency, how to increase the output that is associated with per unit of input. The output is associated with per unit of greenhouse gases. Now, there is a concept that people try to promote, which is called climate-smart agriculture. And this notion basically is trying to take technology and utilize it. So 40 years ago, there was no drip. Now we use 40% drip. What it means is that we reduce water consumption by about 2 or 3 million acre-feet and increase yield on average by 15%. Now, the same is with precision. We have many more productivity, not only in California, globally, has gone quite more significantly. So to some extent, the linkage between the university and research and farmers is really big. We are now celebrating 100 years for extension, which is a big, and if we look what extension did, they basically allowed us to, or the university did, through this element of university, researcher, extension, farmers, all this interaction, we really have a situation that we were able to produce more with less. Think about it. 50 years ago, people were speaking about bringing water from the Hill Valley. Today, no one speaks about it. People are speaking about damming Yosemite. No one speaks about it, and we have a stronger agriculture forever. It was because of basically doing things that we need to do now, which is further adaptation. And that brings me to the next point that I will raise, which is controversial, and this is that we really need to have a new environmental thinking. Our environmental thinking is based about one word: defense, conservation. Defense, like in basketball. But the reality is to move a little bit further and to think about protecting of society. Today, we cannot think about, okay, let's fight with climate change without the best of science. GMO, no. It's like saying, I have to go to the emergency room, I don't use my car because they generate fume, let's take the horses. I really think that we really, most of this, and we have to recognize, when it comes down to biotechnology, we are the leader in the world. In the same way that California, like all what's going on energy, because we will produce electric car, we will produce the new plants, the new varieties, because we have the best university. But if we really try to have all this regulation, that today you cannot mention genetic modification in this state, I think we really set, not us, the rest of the world to failure. We could survive on organic with no chemical because we are rich. But what happened to these other people? And we have a global responsibility as well. So I really think that we really have to think about an environmental thinking that is based on three principles. Conservation, which is really important, get more than that, use better energy, reduce the fertilizer use, for example, and then you move to better fuel, increase energy efficiency. The second element is recycling. The third element is the element of basically moving to biological-based system and taking and increasing the efficiency of biological system. By all means possible, we can go from eco-agriculture to biotechnology and have a continuum that is science-based without worrying about every little thing. To me, we really have a situation in the state that we really eventually will have to change the footprint of the state. Build bigger houses, using more taller houses, being more dense. There is no reason that in Fresno a household will use more water than a farmer. You really need to live a little bit more condensed. And I think that the financial crisis was a hint what happened with something like this, because people live more condensed. You cannot build public transportation. They drive much more. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is to really start to think about what will happen to future of industry. Temperature is going a little bit higher, Napa will be in problem, but there will be some opportunities a little bit up north. Third thing is about water. Water is the big issue. We know that the Sierra will melt. Dan mentioned that if the Sierra will melt, we have to do something about it. So one possibility is to build dams. Now, in 1925, we have a big dam in Los Angeles, and it was a disaster. We improved. Once in a while we make mistake. We have the Bay Bridge, but even the Bay Bridge will be improved. To me, we have to think seriously about damming and building capacity to store water. If we have water that is unstable, what will we do? We'll wail or start to think about how you move forward. Whatever people think about the water project that they started in the 1920s. They were implemented in the 1950s. If now all what we think is to think defensively, we don't do this because we will harm this plant, and we don't do that because GMO are dangerous and dams are dangerous, then climate change will happen. We will be really in bad shape. So we really need to think about environmentally based activism, moving forward and thinking about how to change the environment in a way that will be very, very friendly and but will also allow us to take advantage of all what we know. And to me, the university will be wasted if we will be basically shackled, and we will have more people that think about how to design new environmental regulation rather than how to develop policies that basically based on the idea of sustainable development, where you increase productivity while protecting the environment. So I think that is one thing. The other thing is the issue of incentives. Now, several years ago, we were working on something called the Conservation Reserve Program. Now, the Conservation Reserve Program is a great program, but it was initially designed as a subsidy to farmers. So what it did, it gave farmers money for diverting land. So what did they do? They basically diverted the least productive land. So what we came with this idea, and we developed, before the GIS, we did GIS even though we didn't know the term. We basically look at benefit per unit of land, and economic benefit and environmental benefit, and we basically use the money in a smart way to maximize the benefit per environmental, to maximize the benefit per dollar spent. So for example, we defined 5 or 6 ideas: reducing soil erosion, reducing wind erosion, protecting plants, improving water quality, protecting migrating birds. And basically we said, okay, we have this money. This money will be targeted so it will get the maximum benefit for the dollar spent. It's not perfect. There were politicians involved. We have 4 senators that represent Dakota on about 1 million people. California, we have 2 senators. So the California senators were totally uninvolved in the debate. They have to protect Silicon Valley. So there is a lot of protection of the environment in Dakota. At least. But the point that I want to raise is that the idea of payment for ecosystem services is that you use public money, identify environmental objectives, and maximize the benefit per dollar spent. And now, how you do it? You identify the environmental objectives that wouldn't be achieved in any other ways. Now, there are several reasons why it happened. In some places, people have historical rights to pollute. Generally speaking, pollution didn't occur because people say, oh, I love to pollute, but because I would like to produce some iron, and I have a mill, and there is a little bit of smoke. In the beginning, no one paid attention. Then it becomes pollution. Pollution is a more recent term rather than to iron. So we really need to develop a mechanism where we buy out people that have entrenched right to pollute. For example, we buy the right to land where we have forests we want to preserve. So that's number one. In terms of carbon, there are certain type of activities that should get payment for ecosystem services. Several years ago, I was working with a White House team that came with the idea of paying for carbon sequestration. Now, you don't need to pay every farmer every time that they use no-tillage, but if you use no-tillage creatively, or if you introduce an area where you can sequester carbon, it can make a big difference. For example, you can pay people to experiment with new technologies. For example, there are new varieties and new type of crops that can reduce the methane in production of carbon. By the way, one way to reduce methane is to produce new varieties of soybean that are available and developed in California that are easy to digest, so you have less greenhouse gases. Again, they are GMO and they are on the shelf. No one develops them. But the basic point is that you have to pay for activities that generate a lot of benefit. Now, the big issue about payment for ecosystem services that everyone is taught in there. You go to FAO, everyone said we can solve the problem with payment for ecosystem services. The problem is that someone has to pay. And generally speaking, it's difficult. So you can go and say the Gates Foundation will pay. They have other people. So to some extent, we really have to recognize that we have to be very selective when we use payment for ecosystem services, only when it's really justified. On the other hand, in many other issues, you have to use other technique. You know, one example is all this idea of cap and trade, seeing it's a nice idea. Another example that I personally think is very important, and again, I say one dirty word, GMO in public, carbon taxes. You cannot avoid all these solutions. You can have payment for ecosystem services if you have carbon taxes. And to some extent, you may reduce sales taxes or I don't know what. You can balance your system, have carbon taxes, and some of the money can be used for payment for ecosystem services. So to some extent, when we look at climate change in agriculture, and I think the way we cope with climate change, that's the way the world will cope. If it's not, and we don't need to do it in the most religious, environmental, we have to do it in the most way that will allow development, economic growth, and economic sustainability. So we have to do it by using technology, being daring, taking care of environmental consideration, and having our financial house in order. I think if we do it, I think we will be a model. We will be better off, and the rest of the world will learn from us. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Zilberman. There's a lot here to think about, and the first thing I want to do while I'm collecting my thoughts is if you all have questions for each other based on what you said. If the governor were here, I don't know if you saw his comments earlier last week, he's very intrigued with how do we as California, as one state, really start to create the critical mass of others doing what needs to be done. And what you're saying, as I understand it, is that we keep doing with a lot of good science, being the model, and that we can help drive more of the change that's necessary by really focusing on what we're doing here and proving that it can work in other places. Did I understand? Okay.
That's the idea, yes.
Okay.
So I think the answer here is one, you know, in California we've built institutions. We have this cap and trade system that's working.
Right.
We have a tremendous record of energy efficiency standards. In agriculture, we have a record of amazing technological improvements and innovation. But there's still a lot of things to be done in California. I mean, when you teach undergraduates basic economics, a well-assigned property right is a beautiful thing, right?
Yes, it is.
So there are lots of parts of the California economy where, property rights aren't, assigned in a way that would lead to an efficient outcome. So there's a lot of room for us to do better, I think, still. But if you're thinking about really the road forward, California emits 1% or a little bit above or below of global greenhouse gas emissions. This is rounding error in terms of global emissions. So even if we meet AB 32 by 2050, we will have at tremendous costs, which is maybe, we're a wealthy place, so maybe that's the right thing to do. But we will have reduced global emissions by 0.8%, which is, maybe not the best use of overall dollars if we're talking about it as a species, not as Californian citizens. So I think looking at this problem as a global problem and trying to do the right thing here and show that it works and that it's incentive compatible and leads to outcomes that are desirable will make others hopefully look here and see that it can work. But the word hope is in that sentence in capital letters.
Yeah. You said a lot, yeah.
Let me just add one thing. I thought I might say something controversial here, but I was really happy that David, to summarize David's comments, he says more GMOs and higher taxes. That's his platform, and he's sticking with it. So, but quite seriously, I think it is important if the globe is going to do anything serious about climate change in a way that's cost effective, which is David's point about ecosystem services. Higher taxes and more technology are both going to be required, and to target what we pay as consumers again to things that reduce greenhouse gas output is the only sensible thing to do, and to do that, to figure out some way to do that on a global scale. Let me add one thing to what Max says, and my concern about some of what we've done in California, particularly California agriculture, which is where I have some familiarity, is that if we implement some rules here, say dairy processing plants here meeting AB 32 standards, and if the rest of the world looks at that, and if the consequence is a shrinking dairy sector here because it's cheaper to process those dairy products in Idaho or New Mexico, that is not what would happen if those standards were put on globally. It would give exactly the wrong message, and somebody in China or Washington, D.C. says, oh, if you regulate greenhouse gas standards, you lose your industry. That wouldn't be true if it were done at the right scale, and yet somebody could get that message. So I think it is absolutely crucial that what we do in California is sensitive to this global market competition as well as the global nature of climate change. And I'm not, I don't know if we've gotten the balance right yet. If we're trying to influence politicians while we're influencing markets, it's a delicate thing to work on.
Yes.
I think that one thing that's really important is that there are three concepts that we can really try to suggest. Is when we look at climate change, is what Dan said, cost effectiveness. We really fight it as effectively as possible. The other thing that I think Dan said is really important, that California is very successful when we sell prosperity. I have a group that I bring every year called the Environmental Leadership Program, and bring them all over, and I went them to show some of the poverty in California. Their thing was, you are stuck in poverty. We are really good when it comes down to showing that you can do more with the resources. So it's really important. We cannot have industries that will move to new greenhouse gas regulation that will be decimated. So people have to realize. And I think the other thing is, people don't like to speak about it, we are very good in technology. we have to continue to have this educational industrial complex. The university need to have the edge, because that, if you look at California, both biotech and computer are based with this fact that we really selected to have a great set of universities that work with industry. So I think if we can keep these things, prosperity, cost effectiveness, and science-based industry, the world will benefit.
Dan, you talked about digesters. Sorry to keep coming back to that, but it's something that seems like we should be able to solve. And the cost of putting that electricity back onto the grid. But I think there's great possibilities potentially for the biodigesters in the realm of transportation fuels. Have you taken a look at that? Are we just too far away from that being a realistic outcome?
Yeah, well, we've looked at both the transport fuel, but also the natural gas side of it, where you refine the biogases enough that you can put them not generate electricity on the farm and put the electricity into the grid, but put the biogases into the grid. The complication with that one, and I think also for the transportation fuels, is the refining. You're starting off with a dirty product, so to speak. We're talking about how to deal with cattle manure, which isn't a clean product to start with. You're getting the methane. It's tainted a bit, and then you have to clean it up, and that is an expensive process with lots of scale economies. And so even you can think of a large farm, 10,000 cows or so. It's still a small refinery when it comes to dealing with natural gas, and so far those have been the problems. I'm not the engineer. Everybody's working on it. Maybe it'll get solved, but so far at least it hasn't gotten there with 50% subsidies, 60% subsidies. So when David talks about cost effectiveness, none of these are yet, even if we're going to subsidize or do something to encourage it. That doesn't mean we don't do research on it, we don't do demonstration projects. All of those may make some sense, but I don't see it. I mean, let me say, people in the business are always selling you something, as you know, and they all want an endorsement on some product they have. And there may be somebody in this audience who has the right technology that is commercially ready now, but I haven't seen them yet. David mentioned, or Max mentioned, the idea of improvements in the feeds, and that is something a lot of people are working on there at Davis and other places. It's not just changing the ration a bit. It's some of that, but it's also developing the feed specifically to have less gas from the bovines, and that's from both ends.
Right. Yeah. Before I turn this over to you all in the audience for your questions, Max, I'm not sure that I gave you ample opportunity to talk about a paper that you have coming out in the Journal of Climate Change. Do you want to touch on that while everyone's collecting their thoughts and saying, pick me first, pick me first?
That's a good strategy, stuff people don't really want to hear while so they can think about their own questions. No, I'm joking, I'm joking.
I didn't mean it that way.
No, so Ben Santer a long time ago was, not a long time ago, but some time ago was working on detection and attribution of climate change patterns on the climate system. So I was part of Working Group 2 in the IPCC, and we're looking at, can you actually detect impacts of an already changed climate on human and natural systems? So that doesn't mean looking at changing rainfall patterns, but actually adding a layer on top. Can you see in agriculture impacts of already occurring 1 degree warming, changes in rainfall patterns that we can attribute through models to climate change on those sectors? In the fourth assessment report, the only real impacts that were talked about were impacts on so-called phenologies, butterfly patterns changing, flowers blooming earlier. So there was a lot of evidence on that. So this time we went through the entire social science literature, which was quite a challenge, I have to say, and nobody calls it detection and attribution either, so you really have to dig into the papers, and looked at what sectors actually are already affected. And if you look at the new IPCC report, this is chapter 18 in Working Group 2, we have this beautiful map that was on the BBC too that actually locates across the world where we're seeing impacts. And you're seeing a lot on glaciers. This is documented evidence where there's no other factor that can account for the type of melting we're You're seeing impacts on agriculture. There's always confidence levels associated with that. Agriculture, of course, a lot of other stuff is happening, but we're seeing the impact of extreme yields. We're also seeing that extreme weather events have preceded most of the extreme price spikes for a lot of commodity worldwide. Again, stepping back from a causal statement here, but there are patterns here emerging that are very much consistent with climate change, even if you account for the other factors. The thing we did in this paper, and it's out in Climatic Change, is essentially establish a language and a framework that allows you to speak in these terms. How do you actually do an exercise looking at, observed impacts of climate change on these human and natural systems? So the reason for doing is that we're probably going to do this IPCC exercise again in 7 years. I don't know if I'll do it again. It's 30% of your time working for free, which is not a very lucrative deal, but worth doing. But the point here is, there may be impacts out there, but we're just not writing about them. So giving people a little bit of an impetus here to see, can we see impacts, or is there no evidence of impacts for certain sectors, and write about that more instead of projecting things 100 years forward was the point of that paper.
It helps make it more real for people to try to understand what is otherwise pretty complex.
Policymakers like that map.
Yeah, that's good. So we have a question right here, sir.
Yeah, my name's Ben King. I'm with King Golden State Orchards. I grow almonds and pecans in California. So my question is, when you look at permanent crops, and obviously permanent crops are a long cycle investment, you put a lot of money in, someday you get some fruit or some nuts off that, or grapes. So you have to think forward in the future, and I think I appreciate the opportunity to do this and this. How do you look at the net benefit from one, CO2, taking CO2 out of the air? Is there, if we lost half our permanent crops in California, how would that affect air quality? And secondly, if we lost half our permanent crops in California, how would that affect the economies of California? From, the great thing about permanent crops, it provides jobs year round. And so it's different than the type of agriculture. So when you guys are looking at these policy priorities, have you thought about that from a point of like CO2 remuneration versus just the economic benefit? And where should our state priorities when it comes to issues of water and everything be? Because of just the nature of growing trees is a good thing, And that's how I kind of look at what I'm doing.
Yes, David.
Okay, I think that this is something that we have been working on for many, many years. How do you assess the benefit of different agricultural activities in California? Now, because think about it, we always have very scarce water in the state. So when we look at what are the benefits that you produce from a ton of almond, okay? So there are benefits to you, to make money. There are benefits to jobs. Then there are benefits to consumers that consume the product, and then there are other benefits. So altogether, if we take the benefit from carbon sequestration, they are relatively small. So relatively speaking, they are not very significant. The main benefit that you have for almost all high-value crop is the fact that we are the major, most effective producer of this crop in the world, and the main losers from having, let's say, less almond or less potato or less tomatoes is for consumers. So at least from my view, what we are really good at is producing high-value crops. So I really think that if we have even 60% of the water and we produce high-value crop, and like Mark said, we have a system that is flexible and we move the water, and we continue to have this incredible productivity, we are very, very good at it. Like Dan said, if you produce dairy, do it right. So I think our main advantage is the value of the product that we are producing. That more than anything else. In terms of jobs, there is some value, but I think the biggest value is the value from an economic perspective, is the value of the product.
Max, you wanted to add to that?
So to add to jobs, and I think Dick Howitt and Dave Sunding will probably speak about that this afternoon, but we've had a nice back and forth about what the impact of droughts is on agricultural employment. And what we're seeing, if you just look at the data for the counties that get irrigation water, you see a really strong correlation between irrigation water deliveries from the federal and the state water projects and farm level employment. And if you look at what happened during the last major drought, you saw, depending on whether you use Dick's number or ours, somewhere between 5 and 10,000 fewer agricultural direct jobs on farm. So it's hard to tease out these effects and how much of that is really due to climate change versus withholding of water due to endangered species type protective activities. But there's a direct impact not only just on consumption, but also on households that rely on labor income from these activities that can't necessarily just turn around and say, I'm no longer working in an almond orchard. I'm going to go work in Silicon Valley doing something else. So this is, I think, a really, really important question, something very hard to tease out, but I think something we should do much more work on and for more crops than just almonds, but looking more broadly.
Dan, you were...
Well, with respect to the obvious way to think this through is, say, for a long-term change like climate change, if we were to either through the climate change themselves or through regulations that we put in place to deal with greenhouse gases, we were to discourage permanent crops in the Central Valley, we're really moving back to the past. In 1890, California was the second biggest wheat producer in the country. The Central Valley was wheat. Wheat can grow winter wheat can grow in California. And you think about the employment that's used in the wheat industry, it's approximately zero. And so you're really changing, and the value per acre and per unit of water and all those sorts of things. And so it's not that the land would be idle, some would be idle, but a lot of it would be going to lower unit of output, lower unit of labor per farm, and that could happen if we make the wrong choices.
As one example, the water bank in 1992, that was, in my view, a huge success story. What happened was, we had a drought, there was some water at the rice field, and we allowed an exception to move it to the trees. We saved the trees, we saved jobs. So to some extent, when we have a drought, we have to use our water rights. We have to overcome obstacles to move water. Otherwise, we lose high-value crop, we lose the trees. If you have a tree that is dead 1 year, it cannot be resurrected, and we lose market. So to some extent, you have a very valuable industry, and we have to keep, especially the high-value crops in the state.
Great. Oh my goodness, who was first? Who's going to help me with this? Ma'am, you?
Microphone, please.
White sweater and a scarf.
Hi, I'm Isabel Call. I'm a PhD candidate in Ag and Resource Economics at UC Davis. My question is about the educational industrial complex and maximizing benefits. And I'm wondering how we invest resources in researching for innovation in California to adapt to climate change and extension to other countries so that farmers there can adapt. When the less they adapt, the better consumers they might be for our products if we're adapting faster. Thanks.
Who wants to go first?
Well, let's deal with the last statement that you made.
Yeah.
Lower technical, if in a very specific way, if we have a peach technology here that's better than anybody else, then our industry wins relative to their industry. What we know in a long-term strategy, however, is economic growth everywhere in the world is good for the kind of products that we sell here. So I think we do want to encourage agricultural development globally, partly because it stimulates economic growth, and that's just a good thing for people, and we care about them. It also makes them consumers of the sort of things that we sell. So all of that's to the positive. Here at home, here in California, the stages that go from research through extension to implementation, and especially, and maybe more important, the information that flows in the other direction from producers through extension or directly to researchers to help people, encourage them to know what to work on. That has worked quite successfully. The model hasn't worked other places. I'm not sure it's the right model most other places. So I'm not a huge advocate for saying take the U.S. university-based cooperative extension system and try to plant it other places. There's a world of 50 years of failure in that. Maybe it can work, maybe it can't. But I don't think we just assume that that model works everywhere.
Max, you wanted to add something.
I love that question. So one of the efforts in California that's made us really unique was the so-called PEER program out of the California Energy Commission that every couple of years started this California Climate Change Impacts program where we broadly reviewed impacts of climate change observed and projected on the California economy, and it looked across all sectors. So for example, the only paper that broadly looked at the impacts of climate change on specialty crops came out of that effort. That was financed out of something called the Public Goods Charge. That went away. That program went away. It's coming back as something called EPIC, I believe, but which is going to focus only on energy-related activities. So it really crowds out most of the agricultural impact study, which to me is a very worrisome development. I mean, if you're looking at the amount of money that went into that project to study such an important sector of the economy, it was peanuts. I don't even know if we grow peanuts in California. We don't. Okay, thank you.
You should have said pistachios or something.
Pistachios, there you go. It wasn't, we probably grow a lot of pistachios, so maybe the wrong thing to use too. But the point here is we really have to think a little bit more broadly, and maybe some people in the room here know about efforts that I don't know about, how we go ahead and go forward and continue this, push for academic research on the impacts on climate.
That's a good point. David?
I think our extension in California evolved. And it's evolving. For example, you don't know it, but the reason that people started 4-H was that 100 years they educate the parents through educating the children. Now we operate a lot where extension actually is not educating farmers, they educate consultants.
Right.
And I think that the important thing is to have this realization that you really have this type of continuum and to know that the form is different. The type of, if we have scientists in other countries that exchange with us, they develop a system that is appropriate there. But the key element is the transfer of knowledge. Generally speaking, I don't really see California agriculture to stay the same because we have the capacity to reinvent ourselves. And a lot of time, as we move, we develop new crop, other countries develop new crop, but as long as you have a base of knowledge that is competitive and is ahead of everyone else, we're really doing well. The thing that I worry about is that we decided, okay, we have enough money that was spent, let's reduce support for agricultural research, let's not provide information to other countries, let's isolate ourselves, because we will be the loser in the long run. The best example is strawberries. We had two parts of the strawberry industry, the processing and the fresh. The processing is dwindled, and people say that's terrible because someone else is taking away our strawberry production. But at the same time, in China, they want so much fresh strawberry that we export more fresh strawberries than ever. So I think we need to be open to the world.
I have just a couple questions. Barry?
Hi, I'm Barry Bedwell. I'm with the California Grape and Tree Fruit League. We're a public policy organization that represents the permanent fresh fruit crops with the exception of citrus and avocados. I have to say that. So a more specific example a little bit in that we're all encouraged to see less skepticism about climate change. We're seeing less of that. But there is the growing concern of the real economic impact, and a specific example for us would be table grapes. When we're looking at a situation where we've quintupled our production in California over the last 40 years, but at 117 million boxes, we're just over 10% what China is producing. They're at about 1 billion boxes, and they filed for access to the U.S. market about 3 years ago. Now, it's going to be a number of years before they get here, but our growers are sitting here saying, look, we understand climate change and its long-term implications, but in the short term, how are we going to pay more for our energy costs and compete against a country that wants to come in and compete against us? So I'm wondering, how do we encourage our folks to move ahead in a positive fashion? I unfortunately see either some kind of government assistance coming into this, or, as you mentioned, Dr. Sumner, the restrictions on consumption or rules saying you should only buy this country or that country. How realistic is that, and how would you suggest I should respond to our members?
Well, Barry, I hope I didn't say I was an advocate for country of origin restrictions or state of origin restrictions. What I will say is that if consumers and voters want characteristics of products, say those that are more sensitive to climate, they ought to recognize they have to pay for it. They can't just put a regulation on an industry and say that'll solve the problem, because it really is what we consume, not what we produce. It's a very dangerous position to say, gee, the Chinese have an advantage because they don't meet this set of regulations, so therefore we need to keep them out. Because as you know, everybody else in the world that we ship table grapes to or other products to will say, well, California, they have a university system that's paid for by the public. That's unfair. We'll keep out their products. Or, gee, they've got a highway system or better ports than we have, or you name it. So it's, you know, just about every industry can point to some advantage somebody else in the world has, and they're both pointing at each other, and then we know we lose if we block trade on those bases. So I don't know what to say that's comforting to the table grape producers. It is certainly true that if the Chinese are really good at producing table grapes and they're not consuming as many there, there's a potential they're coming here. Where what is true, however, is that Chinese are consuming a lot more fresh fruits and vegetables. So when I responded to Elizabeth earlier saying the best thing for us is rapid economic growth around the world, I think that's also true in China. In the short run, this does raise a major issue. We can say, gee, let's put some regulations in California thinking about some long-run, particularly political interaction that will improve greenhouse gas solutions worldwide next decade, the decade after. Meanwhile, the table grape industry says, yeah, but I'm not going to be here then. And that is a real challenge when we think about regulatory affairs here in California.
Exactly. Max, I think you wanted to add something?
A quick answer to that is, you know, how do you think the solar panel manufacturers in the U.S. felt about the Chinese competition? So there are billions of dollars of subsidies going into the manufacturing of solar panels in China. The policy goal here has to be, and when one speaks to one's regulator, it has to be the solution to this global problem has to be a global solution. Now, I'm not the one that's going to agree that 200 countries are going to agree on one common set of goals and we're going to do this within reasonable time. But if you can get the G8 or the G20 to agree, we will jointly impose the following set of regulations, a carbon tax or whatever it is, and we will enforce it at the border, right? Saying if you also have a similar mechanism, you can import and export as much as you want, but if you don't have a similar regulation on the books, we will charge you our carbon tax on your product at the border. There are WTO issues here. It's, I know, fairy tale dreaming by an economist. But as we go ahead and realize that climate change is a reality, and if you look at the recent coal versus utility split on how they're going to approach the proposed regulation by the Obama administration, we should go to our regulators and say we should tax carbon globally, or at least with our major trading partners. That way you get 80–85% of global emissions, and you have a system that doesn't create this competitive distortion at the border.
I think that in climate change, I think what Max said, there is a big tension between global carbon tax or regulation that we will benefit, because anything that is global we will benefit from, versus the fact that we do something unitary and others don't do it. But I think when it comes to something like grapes, you really have to see what is the real reason or if it's the excuse. Altogether, I think California will benefit from exporting fruit and vegetables to China more than China will benefit from exporting fruit and vegetables to California. And it's really not comforting if you grow something that will go there. To me, what you really have to do is to fight against regulation that don't allow you to be as good as you are. And I think that we have a lot of this regulation now here.
One more question. Sir. Yeah, you're the one. Stand up.
Thank you. Farhad Farnham, California Department of Water Resources. Perhaps I should save this question for the adaptation panel this afternoon, but I cannot wait. My question to the panel, how effective do you think a changing cropping pattern is in trying to minimize the impacts of climate change on California's agriculture? And if you think it's effective, what changes do you foresee?
I think you put mitigation and adaptation both in the same question, didn't you?
So.
You know, there are ways to grow crops that have fewer greenhouse gas emissions in the long haul. And across crops, they vary somewhat. Pierre Morel and others have done work on that. But at least our assessment is those aren't the biggest things for California agriculture. Partly on the crop side, they're just not, the costs of those adjustments don't seem to be as big a deal as say on the livestock side, where you have a concentrated industry with more emissions. Let me give you an example. Maybe there's fewer greenhouse gases from growing almonds relative to walnuts or vice versa, but at least nothing I've seen suggests that's a big deal. The same with trying to do conservation tillage sort of things, because you end up having 10 or 15 years that you might have conservation tillage, then you plow, then you lose, or then you disc up, and then you lose the greenhouse gas advantages from that. So I don't see as much on the crop side. Fertilizer is an example. Nitrogen fertilizer is an exception. And the more we can deliver the nitrogen fertilizer through, say, subsurface drip, like we're now doing with processing tomatoes, the more we can really get a lot more tomatoes per unit of water, per unit of fertilizer, and per greenhouse gas association. So that's an example of technology. Ironically, for tomatoes, none of those benefits are there for organic tomatoes, processing tomatoes. So here's a case where without doing the full assessment, there are a number of reasons to think that non-organic processing tomatoes are much more environmentally friendly, for example, than organic processing tomatoes. So there are things we can do, and I think we move in this direction. The more we encourage people to adopt technology or make technologies available to them, like subsurface drip for processing tomatoes, the more progress we can make along these lines.
Okay, and David, you get the last word.
Okay. I see
Let's be slow.
you answer this question differently in the Midwest and here. In California, the crops basically are so valuable in many cases, the crops that matter, that if you grow them, you adjust the input. But there are many ways, like I think what Dan said, you can adjust the input. We have a system called CIMAS, which is California Irrigation Management Information System, that resulted in a lot of changes of irrigation during the season. Moving to subsurface drip. Precision farming, we only now start seeing the impact of precision farming. So to me, in California, what really will make the difference is changes in practices and changes in varieties rather than changes in crops. The key element is how much would you have of pasture and alfalfa or stuff like crop like this that are important. But to me, they will be the crops that will be marginalized. Dairy will be a big challenge, but the main crop, I think, the big element are practices. And I think as long as we have the research, we can really improve.
So there are many more questions. Hopefully you all will be around most of the day, but please join me in thanking Dr. Auffhammer, Dr. Zilberman, and Dr. Sumner. Julie Lunch.
On behalf of the Giannini Foundation, I'd like to thank Secretary Ross for participating, attending today, and getting a very lively discussion going. We all learned so much. Thank you very much.